seen the movie The Wizard of Oz? I have, many years ago, mind you, but I can remember being really disappointed when they finally came to where Oz was, and then they went to see the wizard. They pulled back the curtain, and there was just a man, a man who was on a microphone talking to the people in the country. Quite strange, actually. I find that really interesting and disappointing because the person they thought had all the answers, all the charisma, they had in their imagination built up this guy to be something really fantastic. And then they discovered he was just your average person. I think some people think of Jesus that way. They think he's just some average guy who was born a couple of thousand years ago, and he was in an environment where everybody looked at him as if he was some supernatural person. But I think the story that we hear this week from Matthew 17, verses 1 to 19, makes Jesus different. It teaches us something more about Jesus than what we would have otherwise thought. It stops us thinking of him simply just as a man. So the disciples, James, John, and Peter, all went up with Jesus up to on the mountain. They don't tell us what mountain it is, by the way, but we can just guess at the mountain. But they went up there, and they were told that they were going up to pray, that Jesus was praying. Great, they thought that was going to be it. It's what they'd seen before. And this story comes just before the crucifixion. It's in that process of Jesus becoming, I guess, a different person. So they go up there, and lo and behold, something amazing takes place. This cloud envelops them, and Jesus is seen talking with Elijah and Moses. Quite fantastic. Can you imagine what that must be like, speaking with Moses and Elijah? The disciples were absolutely terrified. I think I'd be absolutely terrified too if I confronted that scene. And then this cloud is sort of heavy cloud, same sort of cloud that was speaking to them in, I suppose, when Moses was spoken to by God, and also Elijah was spoken to by God also. So the disciples heard God speaking, and they heard him say, "This is my beloved Son with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him." Oh, amazing. A voice coming from out of nowhere. They couldn't see God, but they could see these other two. I think I'd be terrified. Some of the stories that are told of this particular incident say that the disciples buried their heads in the soil that was around them. It was just too terrifying to look at. One of the things that we really, I guess, can learn from this as disciples these days, not just as the disciples in those days, although they learnt this lesson also. They was able to see Jesus now in a new light. Jesus was not the person that he'd been previously. He was not simply just a man. He was more than a man. He was the opposite to what, I guess, Dorothy and her friends found when they went to Oz. He was the opposite. What they thought he was simply a man. Suddenly he became supernatural. So they realized something quite profound. And it would have had an impact on them from that day forward. So it had the ability, this experience, to strengthen their faith. By seeing this, they realized if he's not just a man, then that means that we have access At this time, especially before he died, went to the cross, we have access to this superhuman, this God-type figure who has all the answers. And God's actually said, listen to him. So their faith was strengthened incredibly just by simply experiencing this. Now, our faith too can be strengthened incredibly simply by knowing that this experience happened to the disciples. They were changed forever. They could go through difficulties, difficult times, all sorts of things could come upon them, and they were not afraid. And one of the other reasons they were not afraid is because it's as if time didn't exist. Because Elijah and Moses were there, Moses representing the law that they'd grown up with, that they knew, that they'd been taught through their life, and Elijah, who represented all the prophets and the prophecies that had come before, as well as that they knew those prophecies. Suddenly, in this one moment, these people who they'd thought were dead were there, were present with them. No longer did death have any power over these people. And it also confirmed what these people had been teaching and talking about in their past. It confirmed the law, what Moses had put into place and what he'd received from God, how God had spoken to him and given him these laws. And it confirmed that Elijah was also with God and a powerful person, but they didn't die. Wow, if we can get our head around this concept of these people existed still, even though physically they had died and passed away, they still existed in this place beyond time. So it would have given the disciples great confidence that when they're going through their troubles, and when they do die, whether it be through troubles, tribulation, all sorts of different situations, or just simply die naturally, they had the confidence of what was beyond death. Beyond death was life. Beyond death was being able to be in communication and communion with those who have gone before us. There's no sting in death, as Paul the Apostle says. Death no longer holds a sting. We can get from this story confidence that when we die, we in fact live again. How awesome is that? What confidence we have to be able to lean on this one particular example, even in the whole of our Bible. How impactful is that? It takes away all our fears, all our, upset and thoughts of, well, these things happen to me. I've got all of these problems. How am I going to get through them? It lets us know that there's more than just simply this life and this existence. So we have no boundaries. Time now, it tells us there are no boundaries. Death is just part of the process of our journey. And we can go from darkness into light. Let me give you an example. I've had the privilege of being able to go up and hike up Mount Sinai, which is in Arabia. And whether or not it's the exact mountain that Moses went up and received the 10 Commandments on, in a sense, it doesn't matter. Because for me, we walked up, a whole lot of us, I don't know how many of us there were, but there were lots of people in lots of groups walking up in the middle of the night in darkness. And it was difficult. We had torches and some people had headgear, and we were trying to see around us as best as possible. I eventually turned my torch off because even with the torch, I couldn't see anything. I was looking around, but it was really hard. It was a dark night. There was no moon, so it was even harder to see. But it was a struggle also to get up there. By the time we got fairly high, it was very icy and slippery. And the path was very, very narrow. It seemed, well, it did. It got narrower and narrower as we got higher and higher. And it was harder and harder to climb. Some of the rocks, I guess they would call them steps, but they weren't really steps. They were like rocks that we had to climb up and sort of push ourselves up on and then go beyond and climb and keep climbing. Apart from the fact that it was exhausting and the air was very thin up there, by the time we got to the top, it was very satisfying. But we'd been in the dark all the time. Now we went to be able to see the sunrise. And I thought, okay, this is great. That's all I'm doing. I'm going to see the sunrise on Mount Sinai, just the beauty of that. But it was so much more. The experience that I look back on now was massive for me. Not because it was Mount Sinai necessarily, but it certainly did relate to the aspect of my spiritual journey. Because by the time we came down, obviously the sun had risen and it was light. We could see, everyone could see where we were. And when we looked, we saw these sheer cliffs, and we saw this danger that was there that we had not realized whilst we couldn't see. When we were in the dark, we could not see how dangerous our journey to the top was. So coming down, we went down another way. We went down a much easier pathway, but at the same time, we could see what we were so close to falling down, hundreds of meters into a gully. Now, it's a whole other thing with WHS in Egypt than it is in Australia. There were no barricades along the side for us to hang on to. It was just a raw pathway. It's a bit like our life and our life journey. Sometimes when we are in the dark, we don't know what we don't know. We can't see because we're in the dark. We don't realize a lot of the time that God is protecting us and looking after us in that dark. We can't see the pitfalls. We can't see the sheer cliffs. And so we don't need to be afraid of them. God is protecting us by allowing us not to see them. But then when we have an awareness of the Spirit of God in us, or an experience of some sort, and our eyes are opened and the lights are turned on, we can sometimes see those things, and we are not necessarily fearful of them, but we can see how God was protecting us before we had that light. I think that's a bit like what the disciples experienced. They had darkness before they saw this transfiguration. And then suddenly the light came on and they were scared. They could see this the scariness of the situation that they'd been kept from previously. But with that fear, there was also a deep, deep confidence that they could face anything from this point forward. They were told to listen to Jesus. And so are we. Listen for Jesus' voice. Elijah found Jesus or God's voice in the still small voice. Moses heard God's voice. The disciples heard God speaking. We too can have that light turned on and experience the transfigured Jesus in our life. All we need to do is just listen. Listen for that still small voice, and you will have reassurance that you are loved and protected in your journey. God bless you.